All right, everybody, welcome back. Bio Bros, episode 9. We're getting back to talking about different styles of vivarium again. This week we're doing desert. You missed 2 weeks ago. That was kind of the traditional tropical jungle style vivariums that most people do, most popular ones. But probably second most popular, I'd say, is desert. So we're going to get into that a little bit. I feel like people do desert wrong a lot of the times. They have this really general idea of what a desert is, but they don't actually truly know what the desert is like because most people haven't been there and it's not nearly as popular in media and everything outside of like the really sandy Sahara style deserts. And there's just way more to deserts than that. So we will get into that kind of stuff, lighting, substrates, plants, how to kind of some styles of building background, all that, just like last time. So, Alex, same thing. We'll start from the top. We'll kick it off with lighting again because you're kind of the lighting guy.
Oh, yeah, sounds good. So, lighting for desert is going to be way more intense most of the time than your tropical lighting, because your tropical lighting is more of like for animals that are going to be living in the lower levels of the forest and stuff. So, there's not as much bright light and like UVB and everything getting down there versus your tropical, or not tropical, versus your desert, excuse me. Desert, most of the time, is going to be, especially if it's a diurnal animal, they're going to be out in the sun, getting high UVB, getting a lot of heat. So you're going to need higher powered lighting. And now again, like I said, it's not every species. So like some species, like um, leopard geckos and trying to think of another any of your like nocturnal desert species, they will still benefit from some UVB. And you'll still want to do things like heat lamps and stuff as well for them, but they don't need it as much, like, or as strong. So we'll start off with like one of the most popular desert ones, like bearded dragons. So essentially, for anything that is out in the daylight all time, so like bearded dragons, Uromastics, um, they need a 10.0 or stronger UVB, and that will basically or the UVB gives them the system replacement from the sun to help them metastasize calcium. And then when you get to your nocturnal species like leopard geckos and things like that, or crepuscular, since they're technically the crepuscular, you'll need like a shade dweller UVB. So they're still getting a little bit of UVB, but it's not that insane direct sun. And then when it comes to heat lamps, you'll want to do a very hot spot, and depending on the species, it can range. Obviously, do your research on the specific species that you're going for. But I know like my bearded dragon Roger, I keep his hot spot probably about 100 to 115. And I do that just with a straight basking bulb. Don't use your I wouldn't recommend using your ceramic heat emitters and things like that, because it doesn't stimulate your animal as much as the actual light showing where there is a hot spot for them. Now, with things like leopard geckos and stuff, you would do a lower wattage heat bulb. You still want to have an asking spot between like 80 to 90 degrees. And the thing with them is they're more likely you'll want to do that kind of over like a rock, because at night, once the light turns off and it's getting dark, they'll come out and they'll lay on that rock and absorb the heat from it that it took in all day.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is the ceramic heat emitter. I'm not that much of a hater on it. For a minute, I was, but then I was reminded by one of our buddies that I live in the desert and I don't have to deal with this. But ceramic heat emitters are great at raising the general temperature of the tank. So if you live in a cold area and let's say they want their cool area to be 80, 85 maybe, and
Mhm.
you can't quite get there with just a spotlight basking bulb, you can toss a ceramic heat emitter in there and it's basically a little space heater. And so it'll heat the whole tank up a little better. So I'm definitely a fan of that too. And then
Yeah.
heat, the other thing you have to watch out for is getting burned, actually.
Yes.
It's quite common. You see it especially in heat rocks. Do not buy heat rocks. They will get burned on those. And then with the desert, especially, the desert dictionary definition is somewhere that doesn't really get a lot of precipitation. So there is a wide range of temperatures within that. There's cold deserts. Technically, Antarctica is mostly desert. I know that's kind of an outlier, but still, temperatures really drop. Like where I live in Arizona, it'll freeze almost every year. So, something that's going to come into play is hibernation and estivation. So, estivation is hibernation, but during summertime. So, some species actually need to go through these temperatures, even though they don't necessarily experience them.
Hmm.
So, Russian tortoises are big examples of this. I know it's the name's Russian, they're not from Russia. It's a whole history thing. Maybe we'll do a
Hmm.
species spotlight on that because they have a funny history. But they will dig in their holes when it's too hot and when it's too cold. So they need hot temperatures that are way too hot for them to handle. They need that, but they're never going to go in them. They're just going to go down and bury themselves. And same thing, they need temperatures that are too cold, and then they'll bury and they'll come out. And it's just good for their natural behaviors and all that. So you'll have to adjust your lighting schedules since our primary source of temperature control is the light, depending on the seasons as well. That definitely comes into play more. The jungle stuff, it's we're near the equator and even temperatures all year. Deserts start to get farther away from that equator, and it makes it a little trickier sometimes. You need those seasonal differences.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that about the ceramic humidifiers, especially because I wasn't trying to say like don't use them. I was trying to say you can use them, but use them in conjunction with. You don't want to use them just by themselves. Um, like if like you saying exactly, if some people can't get the whole tank's temperature up to that certain spot, so you can use them to help build the temperature, but you don't want to use them solely by themselves for heat.
Yeah, so we'll work our way down just like we did on the other ones. This one, we'll talk about the background style. 3D backgrounds, pretty much everybody wants them in their tank. If you don't have them, you kind of wish you did. They're the best, right? Everybody loves the 3D backgrounds. I don't know who doesn't. Most
Yeah.
popular form for deserts and more arid setups is the foam panels and dry lock. I've experienced with that. I've used it. I helped one of my buddies do it for a ball python, and I currently am building it with my bearded dragon. I will say, I don't know if it's the best. It's quite easy, fairly cost effective, lasts for a long time, and it does look pretty good. But I think I'm going to start drifting into a more uh, like actual rock based background. So using things like concretes, grout, that kind of stuff to have a real like true rock, I guess to say, style background rather than trying to carve it out of foam. But the foam is really nice, and the Drylock hardens real hard on there. Big fan of it, actually. I just don't know if it's quite the best. I would stay away from backgrounds that need moisture, kind of like the cracked cork mosaic stuff we were talking about on jungle ones. Those just don't work in the desert style. They dry out, plants don't root in them. It's just doesn't really work. And usually you're going to want to mimic a rock in the desert, right? With the jungle, you're trying to mimic more organic things. Desert, you're trying to mimic inorganic things. So they're a little trickier, and they're going to be exposed a lot more too. That's something people don't necessarily realize, and they rush through it. In the desert ones, you're not going to have creeping plants. You're not going to have moss. You're not really going to have overgrown plants that kind of obscure it. It's right there. Really take your time on that. Make sure that that is something you are actually truly proud of because it will be visible. It's going to be very hard to hide. Doesn't mean that it's all that hard and difficult, but just make sure if you're going to build one yourself, take some time, do it right. You'll be very grateful for it, especially because you're your hardest critic. You'll always see right where you messed up. So just take time. I'm very happy I'm taking my time on mine.
Yeah, and one thing that a lot of people don't think about doing with desert backgrounds and stuff is incorporating like maybe like ghost wood or cholla wood or some type of like dried out, almost dead looking wood because you're gonna find that in the desert. There's a lot of like dead. shrubs and trees and things like that in the desert. And you're going to find that kind of like dead, dried wood in the desert as well. So I just don't see a lot of people like incorporating that, but I think that's something that could be really cool to incorporate into your enclosures. And as well with things like the dry lock method, one thing you do have to be careful of, at least I think it's still the same with dry lock, is like if you have a species with bigger claws or that's going to be like climbing up in the background, things like that, dry lock method might not be the best for you because their nails and stuff will still go through it because it's not very thick and it'll tear into that foam and just tear it up.
Yeah, definitely have to make sure you have a nice thick layer on there if you're intending on having your animal climb on the background itself, which I think you should do anyway. Side tangent. You should try to maximize usable space in your tanks. You know, if you have a two
Oh,
foot tall
100%.
tank, no reason in not letting them use all 2 feet of that height. Uh, but kind of on your wood thing, like I was kind of led into at the top of the episode, was people think of the Sahara and the Gobi and those just big sand dunes with nothing for miles kind of deserts. That's not really accurate. I live in the Sonoran Desert, and it will be totally green at times. It will be so dense with plants you can't walk directly straight through it, especially since every plant here is covered in thorns. But it is not like that. There's rock everywhere, there's plants everywhere. It's just not the same style that most people are used to, but it is all there. So definitely incorporate things like woods into your tanks. You should be having all those. Most of the animals that we keep in the hobby here, they come from deserts that are not sand. So that'll bring us into substrate. Substrate's a tricky one. I'm doing some experimentation on it. To my knowledge, I'm the first person to try this exact method. I haven't seen it anywhere else. I'll let it leak here a little early for the podcast audience, but we'll be on YouTube soon, full in depth. I'm going to be using clay pigments. So they use them to dye clays that are for making like mugs and stuff. But I'm going to use them to dye bentonite clay, which is commonly cat litter, and mix that with sands and try to create this kind of hard packed layer of substrate. So if any of you guys have ever walked out into a baseball field that hasn't been maintained for a while, you know that hard dirt kind of layer? That's actually more similar to what most of the desert ground is like. Kind of a thin layer of kind of sand, dust, rock, and then it's pretty packed down and hard. And then you dig a little deeper and it actually gets moist. You don't have to dig very deep in the desert to find water. So my plan here and kind of how I'm thinking about it is do a more traditional sand and topsoil mix, which most people will use and recommend for desert stuff. And you know what? It works pretty good. I'm using a similar version before and other stuff. It's done very nice. So doing that for about 2 inches, we'll say. And then I'm going to do that clay harder layer on top for another 2-ish inches. And then that should create a more adequate desert environment where it's not sand. Because bearded dragons, while they can be found on sand, that is actually true. Yes, they do live on sand in some regions. Most of the regions are actually harder packed ground. So I want to try to recreate that. And same thing, leopard geckos. Leopard geckos are not found on sand, but they are found on a kind of loose substrate. So misconception about the desert is sand is everywhere. Not everywhere. Substrates are kind of hard to make. Definitely going to recommend checking out the YouTube video I make on that when it comes out because I should have some pretty good findings on it. Uh,
Yeah, substrate with desert, I've always struggled a little bit with it. But one thing that I know I've always done when you were talking about like the topsoil sand mixture, I feel like this is probably a common like mix up that people do. Probably I don't know, or it could just be me. I don't know. But I always would put too much sand in my mixture, so it would dry out super quick, like the whole thing, not just like layers. Because like desert, basically what you want your substrate to do is the top layer can dry out, but you still want it moist down below. So use probably more soil or like topsoil or what peat or whatever you're using, um, than sand, just because that is more of what that actual substrate layer below the hard packed stuff would be. And if you're doing live plants, it'll help them a lot too, because desert plants do like to be dry, but they don't like to be bone dry all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of tricky. You need some experimentation. Like right now, I have small scale experiments of different substrate mixes just floating around that have been drying outside, bringing back in, mixing them up, putting them back outside to dry again to try to get that mix right. Because it is very hard. Because the desert is bone dry at the top most of the time, and even just a few inches down, it starts getting more and more wet. So you want the bottom of your substrate to be moist. You want the very bottom layer to be not dry, and you want the top layer to be dry. So that's kind of hard for watering schedules. How often do you water? How much do you water? Especially because these dry builds, you don't use what am I looking for? Drainage layer. You don't really use
Yeah.
a drainage layer in them. It's not very common at all. I've seen it be done before, but it seems a little redundant to me. So it's hard. Definitely gonna need some experimentation, and that's the best way to do it. Because your relative humidity levels are gonna affect everything too. So just your house to my house is gonna be different, and it's gonna be kind of hard. But that's part of the joy of the desert is it's kind of funky. It's a little different, and once you get it though, it's really really cool.
All right. And now the reason people don't use a drainage layer as much in the desert, just because that's something people are probably going to want to know, is because you should never have your soil that wet. It should not be wet enough to start growing mold or mildew and things like that. If it is that wet, you are watering your desert enclosure way too much.
Yeah, I am a fan of a seasonal flood though. Most deserted
Yes.
areas, well, maybe not most, most of them that a lot of the animals we enjoy come from will have a wet season. So, like here in Arizona, we have a monsoon season. We're actually just getting out of it right now in summer. So, actually, during the hottest time of the year, we have these huge rainstorms that come in, cause flash floods, tons of water, and then it heats back up and gets dry again. So, I do like a seasonal flood. I like to dump a whole gallon of water in my tanks every so often and let them get wet, but I let them dry right back out. I don't let that sit and ferment and cause a bunch of mold. But another thing for mold control is your cleanup crew. It's a little different in the desert because a lot of the tropical stuff that's really, really common in the hobby does not do well with high heat, low humidity. So make sure the isopod species that you're getting are arid. They're going to do good in dry, hot temperatures. Same thing on your springtails. Don't get tropical springtails, get temperate springtails. And then we get new options too. We get things like darkling beetles, which are grown out mealworms. That's what they will turn into. Superworms, those turn into great cleanup crew as well. That kind of stuff. And even if you're dealing with like an herbivore, you could get real crazy and do something like a blue feigning death beetle as a cleanup crew. So that is kind of fun. You get to have different bugs in your tanks that serve different jobs.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like with the desert too, doing the cleanup crews, it gives you that extra bonus of like versus tropical. Not that we're trying to persuade you to go either way, but it gives you the extra bonus of, or for your animal of like when darkling beetles come out, because like you can just drop mealworms in your enclosure and they'll turn into darkling beetles in the enclosure. Same with superworms, and then you get that extra bonus of like it comes out and you'll see it, and then your animal has that bonus of hunting and like actually wandering the enclosure looking for meals all the time because these things will pop up all the time. Um, and with the desert enclosure, you can also like if you're it's not seeing as many darkling beetles or like stuff like that, you can just add more mealworms and stuff to like continue the cycle.
Yeah, that's definitely my plan. Ideally, I get mealworms to breed in the tank once I get everything
Mhm.
established and set up. That would be ideal. And then she just keeps the population in check on her own. But if that doesn't happen, every so often I'll just grab a little, like 25 or so, whatever smallest cup is they sell at the store, and then hide those back near somewhere she can't find them necessarily, so they'll run away and she won't instantly eat all of them, and then she'll be able to find them, or they'll morph out into beetles. It'll be kind of nice, cool enrichment.
Oh yeah,
But
and having things like flat rocks and stuff too, which are good for basking spots as well. Those are really good too to have on your cool side and your hot side. So like beetles and things like that can get under there, and your isopods and stuff can get under there because under those rocks and stuff too, there'll be little microclimates that hold more moisture because it's not having the light beat down on it, so it'll hold the moisture better, and you'll get a little microclimate. Will be a little more humid. So a lot of times people find under the water bowls, under these rocks and stuff, you'll find little groups of bugs because they're just trying to stay moist like they would in the desert.
yeah, I mean, that's just an overall theme of the desert too, is microclimates, and that's why you hear so many people talk about temperature gradients in your hot side and cool side, is
Hmm.
because you need to get out of the heat and you also need to get into the heat, depending on times of day and all that. So that's just a whole theme of the entire desert too, is keep microclimates everywhere you can. You want nice cool areas, you want hot areas, you want cool areas that are still a little in the sun.
Oh
And by
yeah,
the sun, we mean UV bulbs, right? That's basically the sun. And you want all that that you can get in there, especially in the desert, because deserts are interesting environments. They're highs and lows constantly. Like temperatures will drop a lot at night. Rocks do not do great at holding in heat. They do pretty good, but they cool down a lot more than like organic matter does. Uh,
yeah, which is why for like your compustural species and stuff, they're really good because that way they can come out there right when it's the lights just turned off, like they would in nature, and they can lay on that rock and absorb the heat. And then once it's cooled down, they can start exploring because now they have all that heat inside of them.
yeah. So the last thing we'll kind of get into is plants. Plants is by far the hardest part. In
Hmm.
tropical setups, plants are easy. Pretty much every plant you find at Home Depot will go and do very well in your tanks. And you don't usually have to worry about your animals eating the plants, but desert pretty much the opposite really. Lots of plants do not do well, and a lot of them are dangerous. So whether it's from cactus having vines or all sorts of things being toxic and having a lot more herbivores and uh, omnivores in the desert as well. So you have to make sure everything's safe and all of that. Just one little pet peeve of mine, though, I do have. I know it's kind of nitpicky and you can do whatever you want. Is everybody throws in the spineless prickly pear cactus for the bearded dragon tanks? It drives me insane
Hmm.
because cactus are from the Americas, uh, obviously Australia, bearded dragons. There are no cactus in Australia. Zero. There won't be one. Or in Africa, or in the Middle East. All the other deserts you can think of that don't end in America, no cactus. So that's just a little pet peeve of mine. Obviously, do whatever you want. It's your tank, your animals. And if it's spineless and non toxic, you're fine. And even if it is toxic, but you're keeping like monitors or something, who cares? They're not going to eat them.
Yeah, and one thing that a lot of people don't realize, to kind of backtrack a little bit with the plants, you kind of have to backtrack for this part, but with succulent plants, so when you do your lighting on the tank, that's there's even more of a reason to do daylight bulbs that are like very intense, like bright grow lights or just bright white light based. Not like don't do the blue and purple colored grow lights. Do like the bright white grow lights and stuff because your succulents love sunlight. Like if you do not give them enough light, succulents even in a bioactive enclosure, if you're keeping the soil perfect and everything, but you're just not giving them enough light, that plant will just look great and then all of a sudden be dead like that
Yeah.
because they
One of my
don't
other
show
favorite
signs.
one of my other favorite plants to do is grasses. So there's lots of
Yes.
grasses in deserts. They're not going to be a nice lawn carpet like you think, but they're almost little tufts of grass that hang out, and a lot of them are kind of seasonal. So what I like to do, and I like when other people do it, is plant a bunch of grass and let it grow and then let it all die. And it
Hmm.
looks really cool and it gives you the same benefits as leaf litter would in any other tank, but it's kind of seasonal. It's really cool. I'm a big fan of that. Uh, for my bearded dragon tank specifically, I'm only planning on adding one plant, and it is not from Australia, but I haven't really been able to find a good alternative that's readily available because I do assume she's gonna kill it, and so I want to be able to replace it if I need to. Is the elephant bush?
Hmm.
Those look great. They are easy to trim into a nice bush-like shape and mimic something that is from other countries, even though it's from Africa. I
Yeah.
believe it's Africa, right?
Other ones that I've heard of, people using, especially like even with like bearded dragons, like snake plants, they tend to do well in that desertish environment. Um, and aloe vera, naturally, everyone knows aloe vera. Um, but they do well in that desert succulent environment, and are safe for the animal. But I've seen, I can't remember who it is, but this guy on YouTube that does like a bunch of bearded dragon videos and things like that, and he puts snake plants in almost every single one of his tanks. And it's just a good, tall, hardy plant that they're very hardy. And there's a bunch of different subspecies of them too. Like I have what they call a whale fin snake plant. It's that they get huge leaves, but there's smaller species. There's all different shapes, all different colors, and things like that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the bushes. Lots
Hmm.
of deserts, especially Australia. Australia is a really popular one for animals to come from. So a lot of times we want to mimic Australia. Um, Bushes are everywhere. Most of the animals are bushes. That's why they call it the bush, because there's bushes out there.
Oh yeah.
Tumbleweeds and stuff, that kind of. So people don't, not from the desert, see tumbleweeds, and they're actually this green plant that ends up drying off and flying away. Also, only in Americas, not necessarily in Australia. But that kind of stuff, you'll see a lot of dead, dried out things. So add those in there, toss them into your tanks. Let your dead plants just be dead. That's okay. They're not going to rot. It's dry.
And even if they do break down, that's like we said before, or like Shaw said earlier, was like the leaf litter in the tropical substrate. The isopods, everything will break it down, and that is okay because it's giving nutrients back to the soil that will go back to the plants that you plant again.
Yeah. My intention when I do maintenance and trim up my bearded dragon's tank and clean up her plants when the time comes is just to leave the cuttings. Just gonna cut it and throw them in the tank. They're non-toxic, so if she wants to eat them, she can. If she doesn't, whatever, they'll dry out. And when there gets too many and it starts to look too cluttered, I'll take them out then. But yeah, definitely let your deserts just be deserts. Let them age. Another cool technique I'm actually thinking about trying, I'll let it on because getting close to the end here, is painting my background with a very, very watered down version of my substrate. So when you touch
Hmm.
a rock out in the desert, it's covered in dust, right? So I want to get mix my substrate with a lot of water, the clay-based one, and then paint the whole background with that. And then when it dries, it should adhere to the background pretty good because there's going to be a lot of clay in there, and it'll give it that aged real rock look. And hopefully the clay will be sticky enough that I won't have to replenish it all the time. But that is going to be something that requires upkeep. Every time I spray down water in that tank, a little bit of that clay is going to rub off the background. Eventually, I'll need to redo it. But I think that'll be another good way to add in realism and then blend colors. So, like, my color matching skills are not perfect. I'm not going to have this perfect blend between background and substrate, but if I put actual substrate on there, hopefully we'll blend it a little better.
Yeah, I mean that's actually a really cool idea. I never even thought of.
Yeah, I got the inspiration from seeing some other people on YouTube throw sand at their backgrounds after they're done, but I always thought
Hmm.
that looked like people just threw sand at the background.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, all right, how can I try to manipulate this into something better? Because I like the idea, but it just isn't working. So that was kind of what I came up with.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a really good idea. You'll have to let us know how it works.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the whole thing's going to be filmed, so it'll be on YouTube, and you guys will be able to get a real visual representation of it eventually. But my pigments should be here. Actually, after this episode's up, I should have all that done, so maybe I'll give you an update next week. Um, but yeah, so desert recap. Light, brighter is better generally. Gonna want it nice and hot, pretty intense UV. Obviously, subject to change depending on what species you're keeping, and seasonal changes. Those might need to be taken into account. Backgrounds most popular is foam and dry lock. Again, tons of YouTube videos on that specifically, and I have one coming out as soon as I paint that background and get that last step done. That video will be on YouTube too of just how to do the background. Um, Grout based ones and concrete based ones very common as well. Good strategy. And then make sure you add wood and stuff. The organic matter is still in the desert. It's just different than you think for most desert things. Obviously, if it's a big sandy desert, not going to be as much. If it's a rocky desert, there will be more. Um, Substrates, dry on the top, wet on the bottom. I like layering substrates. Most people do one solid one. I think the layers is the way to go. And then cleanup crew, just make sure they're arid species because the tropical ones that are very common aren't going to do great. Same thing on plants. You want something that's going to do better in that desert environment.
Yeah. So if y'all enjoyed the episode and y'all want to listen to more of this or join the community, make sure to go down into the description and follow us on Instagram. Give us a follow on here on YouTube and a like. That would be really appreciated. And we try to post these every single week. We post them on Fridays. Try to post them around noon as best as we can. But I hope y'all are having a great day, morning, night, whatever it is for you when you're listening to this. And I hope y'all enjoyed this podcast and I hope y'all join our community. Y'all have a nice
Yeah.
night.
See you guys next week. Thank you for listening.